Welcome all to this media launch for Hard Infrastructure, Hard Times report. My name is Shauna MacKinnon and I'm a professor at the University of Winnipeg, and I'm the project director of the Manitoba Research Alliance, whose grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council supported this research, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we release this report today on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota, and the heartland of the Métis people. We acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, and the hydroelectricity that we use to power our homes and offices comes from Treaty 5. However, we need also to move beyond making acknowledgements. We are reminded that reconciliation requires us to take action to dismantle the structures and policies that oppress Indigenous people and limit self-determination on their lands. And we invite all to reflect on these realities wherever you find yourself today. I'd like to start with a quick overview of this morning's program. After my introductory comments, I'll invite the authors of the report to present on its findings. Following their presentation, Michelle Gawronsky, president of MGU, will offer comments from the workers' perspective, and we will then have an opportunity for the authors to respond to questions from the media. So the report launched today by authors Jennifer Keith, Jesse Hajer, and Michael Conway provides an inside look at the impact of the Manitoba government's agenda to privatize and contract out essential government services. The Manitoba Research Alliance is committed to giving voice to those affected by inequitable public policies. This report brings the voices of public service workers to the forefront, whose expertise and experience is being pushed aside in favor of ideologically driven changes to the public service. Beyond affecting public servants, the changes highlighted in this report have lasting impact on society as a whole, contributing to increased inequality as public not-for-profit services are moved to the private for-profit sector. It is in the public interest that we conduct research to expose the detrimental impact of privatization, and this report does just that. Joining us today to talk about the report are its three co-authors. Jesse Hajer is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba. Jennifer Keith is the owner and lead consultant of JDK and Associates, and in her final year as a PhD student in Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Michael Conway is an expert in public infrastructure provision, most recently as regional superintendent with the Northwest Territories Department of Infrastructure. So I'd now like to invite the authors to share their full findings with us, and I believe we're going to be starting with Jesse Hajer.
Thank you, Shauna. As Shauna mentioned, this report examines the push for privatization and contracting out of design and maintenance of Manitoba's infrastructure and transportation services. Privatization is controversial, and there's good reason for this. There's been many disasters in the past that have harmed individuals and communities. The privatization of the rail line to Churchill and the associated year-long closure, the Phoenix federal government payroll contracting out disaster, and the Walkerton tainted water tragedy. These are some of the more prominent Canadian examples, as well as some local Manitoba examples. In addition to the decline in service quality that we see, contracting out to for-profit providers is also associated with worsening working conditions for workers and reduced accountability to the broader public. In Manitoba, under the leadership of the Progressive Conservatives, who were elected in 2016, this government has pursued an aggressive agenda of reducing the size of government. This was based on election commitments to both reduce the deficit as well as taxes, and has arguably been the defining central feature of their governing agenda. Part of this agenda has involved rapid reductions in the size of the civil service and the privatization and contracting out of service delivery. This has occurred in a variety of service areas: home care, air ambulance services, road and bridge maintenance, conservation services, provincial park campgrounds, wildfire suppression, very relevant this year, public housing, social services as well through social impact bonds. The result of all of this has been a dramatic reduction in the size of the civil service. From 2015-16 to 2019-20, the Manitoba Civil Service lost 17% of its workforce. Our report documents the implementation of this privatization and austerity agenda in the Manitoba Infrastructure Department and the Vehicle and Equipment Management Agency. In November 2017, the Government of Manitoba announced a review of these delivery models and policies. The ongoing work included embedding a private consulting firm in the department to develop options and recommendations for a new service delivery model. This strategy called for, I quote, right-sizing public ownership, investment, and maintenance. Despite these plans to significantly change the organization, along with a noticeable reduction in staff, very little has been shared with the employees. Since the initiation of this review, some services previously delivered by public sector workers, such as highway and bridge maintenance, have been contracted out to private for-profit operators. The staff complement of Manitoba Infrastructure and VIMA have been significantly reduced. Since 2016, Manitoba Infrastructure lost 33% of its workforce. This translates into 636 positions that have been eliminated, or approximately $67.5 million in wages and benefits paid to Manitoba workers. Manitoba Infrastructure employees have seen a number of changes, but the government has not provided any indication about the immediate and longer-term plans for service delivery. This has left employees uncertain of their futures and concerned about the quality and cost of Manitoba Infrastructure services. Ultimately, there is great concern for the safety of Manitobans. Given the lack of publicly disclosed information regarding the reforms, our main method of data gathering was through interviews with government workers. This study was promoted, but conducted independently of the Manitoba Government and General Employees Union. We received completed surveys from 124 workers and did 15 follow-up interviews. This represents approximately 10% of the total workforce. I'm going to now hand it over to Jennifer, who led the background research and interview process for this project.
Thank you, Jesse, and good morning to everybody who's joined us. So I just want to talk a little bit about who these government workers are and the work that they do. So Manitoba Infrastructure is one of the original government departments dating back to the creation of the province of Manitoba. It's had some different names over the years, but it's always played this really important role in the growth and productivity of our province. It connects and supports all the components of a vibrant economy that we need. So we all rely on the roads and the infrastructure to get to work, to haul grain to the markets, or to connect our products and services to consumers. So it's really a central part of the vibrancy of Manitoba and the productivity that can happen here. So the workers that we talk to, they clear our roads of snow, they ensure culverts are draining properly so our roads don't get washed out, they repair our roads, they regulate the trucking industry to make sure our highways are safe, and they plan for and respond to disasters. As Jesse mentioned, VIMA was also part of the privatization plans. VIMA was once a part of Manitoba Infrastructure because they're providing the equipment and maintaining it, but they moved out of the department in 2015 and 2016 to begin to operate as a cost recovery special operating agency. So basically, the men and women in VIMA make sure that the men and women in Manitoba Infrastructure have the vehicles and equipment they need to do their jobs. And the fleet of vehicles and equipment is one of the largest in the province, and it includes some really specialized pieces like snow clearing machines and plows and graders. So in addition to the mechanics and technicians and parts shop keepers, we also talk to IT specialists who keep equipment maintenance and inventory programs operating efficiently. So I took part in the interviews with workers along with my colleague, Michael, who's going to speak in a moment as well. And honestly, the interviews were really difficult at times. They were really tough to hear the stories because what stuck out with all of them is that each of these people that we talked to had a real desire to do a good job for Manitobans to keep our roads and highways safe, but they were utterly in the dark. They had no idea what was coming down the pipe. They could see the writing on the wall, but they didn't know exactly what was going to happen or when it was going to happen or how it was going to affect them. They were actually asking us if we had information, which of course we didn't. So it was really tough to hear these dedicated workers who are so important to the prosperity of our province and to the safety of our roads feel so unappreciated and unsupported. Throughout the 15 interviews Michael and I did, the workers shared their stories and experiences with us, and what emerged was 4 themes. They are related to short staffing and impacts of that, a concern that the proposed changes would result in a reduction in the quality of assets and the quality of services. Also, an impact on the cost to taxpayers of Manitoba. And so the first finding that we had is that workers reported that short staffing would jeopardize public safety and lead to burnout. So workers started noticing the reduction in staff starting in 2016. What was happening is if a worker retired or resigned from their position, they were not replaced. And this practice of attrition is a way to reduce the workforce without drawing a lot of attention from the public because there's no big layoff. But the workers felt it, and they said it was like they were slowly bleeding out. They said the hiring freeze was so extreme and lacked a coherent strategy that in some cases there was a 30 to 50% reduction in the workforce, but the reduction strategy didn't align with core service delivery responsibilities, leaving the staff in a difficult situation with regards to public safety. The lack of staff was then used to rationalize the selling off of assets, leaving those remaining without the equipment they needed to do their jobs. Training for the remaining employees was also reduced or eliminated. And as one worker put it, they were just setting them up to fail, they felt. So as a result, staff are burnt out, morale is at an all-time low, and those workers are left feeling devalued. And despite a strong commitment to public service, they were questioning their future with the province. Either they felt that they would be out of a job soon, or they felt that they needed to move on because they just didn't feel that their work was valued. So the second finding was that workers predicted a reduction in the quality of service and assets from the changes. So all of these changes are done under the banner of improving services for Manitobans, but only 2.4% of the workers surveyed believe that to be true. 72% of the workers believe the changes would lead to a reduction in the quality of services delivered. Approximately the same amount, 72%, believe that the quality of assets would be lower after the changes. One of the reasons given for this reduction in quality of service and assets is related to the reduction of staff. So there just was not enough capacity to oversee quality control of projects. So in many cases, the workers are spread so thin, they just have to trust that the companies are doing things properly. Unfortunately, the problems are not always evident immediately. It can take years before it's evident that a highway wasn't constructed to proper specifications, and poorly constructed and maintained roads will end up costing the government in the long term, somewhere in the millions of dollars that it's anticipated. So all of this will also have an impact on worker safety and public safety. The majority of survey respondents believe that the safety of Manitobans would be compromised. So the quote we have on the screen there is kind of a good summation of what they felt is happening. It's about the day-to-day safety of the roads that we travel on every day. The roads that we kind of take for granted will always be maintained in a safe way, but workers really cautioned us that we can't take this for granted under the new service delivery model, and the result they feel will be accidents. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Michael to review the last 2 findings.
Sure, thanks very much, Jennifer, and good morning, everybody. As you can see on this slide, despite cost savings being the government's motivation for contracting out, based on the workers' experience so far, 73% of workers expected the costs to rise. Now, where the private sector will do well in the short term, superficial repairs like filling a pothole, for example, the overall quality of the work suffered, adding costs down the road. That's what we've found so far in our studies in other provinces. And it appears like that's going to be pretty much the same story here in the province of Manitoba. An example might be a culvert that normally wouldn't have to be repaired for 30 years, has to be repaired in 10 years. So there's a good example of a cost down the road where insufficient work, insufficient project management and oversight would lead to costs significantly higher than what we predicted in the regular model. A similar percentage thought that the value that the government gets for taxpayers' money will fall. The message from employees we spoke to was, look, government owns the own force operators, driven, meaning their ultimate concern is to provide a safe operating surface to the public, as opposed to concerning themselves with ways to profit from the tasks like the private sector. So they're not looking at the particular costs as much as they're looking at the end product. And that's what we get from Manitoba highways staff and infrastructure staff. So workers provided many examples of private sector contractors delivering substandard work, requiring constant policing by government staff, and in many cases having to redo the work. An example given last winter was a report of government equipment being called out to remove ice and snow from a highway where a private contractor did not do the task correctly. In order to scrape ice off properly, the equipment operator needs a certain amount of down pressure on the grader's blade, and in order to save on costs, private contractors are remiss to do that. It wears out the equipment faster and costs them more money for the same amount of work. In this situation, the government actually paid twice for the same task. Clearly, not removing snow and ice from a highway correctly has many risks associated with it. Nobody wants to see an accident, especially with something like a school bus that has to venture out onto the highways early in the morning, just after snowfall and ice have accumulated. Now, one of the most significant issues for staff we spoke to was the failure of management to partner with the employees to find ways to be more cost-effective and efficient. There were virtually no efforts made internally by management to use the experience and knowledge of employees, most with many years of experience, to find solutions and improvements. Nobody could explain why. Person after person gave us stories of, or no stories, when we asked them the effects of management coming to talk to them, to ask them, what can we do to improve? This never happened with this organization. And this is probably one of the most difficult things for the employees, is they were never given the opportunity to show how they could improve the services provided. As one worker put it, decisions were just jammed down our throats. Some even described instances of threatening or bullying behavior, with one group of workers being told by a senior official, look, I'm driving the bus. You either get on it or I'll run you over. Instead of consulting its own staff, the government appears to be relying completely on outside multinational accounting firms with track records of promoting and profiting from privatization. When workers were asked about morale in interviews, they used statements such as awful, extremely low, and basically being in survival mode or just getting by. They reported not having any employee engagement or appreciation, and there being no camaraderie anymore, something that used to be a regular thing with workers in Manitoba infrastructure and VIMA. As Jennifer described earlier, the practice of attrition or death by 1,000 cuts is a highly questionable manner of steering an organization into a privatized model. Imagine coming to work every day and another coworker has disappeared and not replaced until there are only a few remaining, no longer with the capacity to complete their tasks and responsibilities. Various employees told us of having staffs of 7 or 8 mechanics that went down to 6, that went to 5, 4, 3, and the work never really changed, forcing them to contract out some of the repairs that should have been done in-house. Employees questioned the government's privatization methods as a cost-cutting initiative, but they were never asked for advice, and ideas for improvements that they did make on their own were virtually ignored. Jesse, did you want to take over the next section?
Thanks, Michael. The negative views of workers are consistent with recent academic studies on the subject. Despite being popular in the 1980s and 1990s, more recently, the pace of contracting out is slowed in response to privatization failures. We're seeing the returning of contracted out services to public delivery being a more and more common occurrence. There's now a general consensus that the quality of publicly delivered services often exceeds that of private provision, and more recent studies suggest that cost savings are generally going to be minimal. Manitoba, however, has not learned from mistakes in other jurisdictions. They're pursuing rapid and indiscriminate reductions in the civil service and the privatization and contracting out of government service delivery. None of the employees interviewed saw any evidence of the government conducting an informed internal analysis to find ways to improve on program efficiency. This is something that is done regularly in progressive public sector agencies. Reviews and restructuring initiatives are important. These things should happen. We need these to help maintain and improve the relevance and effectiveness of public services. But what public administration scholars tell us is that governments should be just as open to contracting services back in as a means to achieve high quality, cost-effective public services. Manitoba's exercise appears to preclude the possibility of such improvements, with reforms being dictated by ideology as opposed to rigorous analysis, according to workers. This politically led strategy has been to starve the public sector, refuse to fill vacancies, and eliminate training and performance planning. The destruction of this internal capacity built up over decades is going to be costly, and it's going to be a challenge to undo. The longer it continues, the more resource intensive it's going to be to rebuild. Manitobans, along with public sector workers, as we've seen today, are already paying the price. What we heard from workers in our research is consistent with what the Manitoba Government and General Employees Union has been saying on behalf of workers since these privatization efforts began. These should be of concern to all Manitobans who care about getting value for public dollars spent, the safety of our highways, and the condition of public infrastructure assets across the province. The MGEU supported this research and helped promote our interviews and survey. I'd now like to welcome Michelle Gawronsky to speak on behalf of the MGEU and reflect on the findings. Michelle is the president of the Manitoba Government and General Employees Union. She represents over 32,000 members across the province, including the members that work for the Provincial Infrastructure Department and VIMA that we are talking about today. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so very, very much. And I have to say, this never gets easier to hear. Good morning, everyone. As I have said in the past, I once again am strongly urging this government to stop their plans for more privatization in Manitoba Infrastructure, MI, and the Vehicle and Equipment Maintenance Agenda Agency, the VIMA. MI is headed down a risky path as more services like road maintenance, heavy equipment maintenance, snow clearing are contracted out, and winter is just around the corner, folks. We have seen the issues with privatization in other jurisdictions. The risk just isn't worth it. After privatizing snow clearing, roads in Ontario are less safe as contractors cut corners to make a profit. In BC, a report found that private contractors focused on cosmetic fixes rather than long-term fixes that would improve the lifespan and safety of the roads. Now we're hearing similar stories from members on the front line right here in Manitoba. Profit before people. There are over 600 fewer staff in MI today than there were in 2016, and VIMA has over 80 vacant positions, or 40% of their staff. It's just not sustainable. We are calling on the Manitoba government to be open and transparent with the future of MI and VIMA and encourage meaningful consultation with employees. Respect these Manitobans. Tell them what they can expect for their future, for their families' futures. By embedding a private for-profit consult in the department, decisions are being made without transparency and without listening to those providing the service. It just isn't right. This report includes the voices of workers, the workers keeping their roads safe and building infrastructure assets across the province, and includes the facts of the numbers of towns and highways already privatized. Members of the public have already started to share their concerns with me already. We know that Manitobans are very worried about the future. The constant restructuring in MI is impacting morale, as was said. Members are stretched thin and the demands of services are increasing. The government needs to hire more people to do the work. Aggressive vacancy management is leading to inefficiency delivery of these services. Is this the plan to create failure? That is the question we've been asking for some time. We would like an answer from the government. And again, we strongly urge Manitobans to step up, tell their MLAs, this is not acceptable for any of us. Thank you so much for listening.
Jesse, Michael, and Jennifer for providing some of the highlights of this report. And again, there's much more in the report that gives us a better sense of the perspective of workers who are going through this and have an important story to tell. Before we move on, I'd also like to just point out that there have been others that helped with this report, and just acknowledge the work of Holly Scotland, who supported the research as a student at the University of Manitoba. And again, thank you to the MGU for the invaluable financial support, along with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council through the Manitoba Research Alliance. And I urge people to check out the full report, which is available on the CCPA's website, which is the link's available in the chat, as well as the op-ed that was published in today's Free Press. Well, thank you all for presenting today. Much appreciated, and thanks for those who've attended, and enjoy the rest of your day.